where you can select either floor, English, or French. As you present your testimony, you can switch. Technical pretests have been carried out. And so with us today for the first hour are the witnesses from the Department of Indigenous Services, Christopher Duchesne, Stephen Traynor, Jacques Boutin, or maybe everyone's not in, but that will be the panel. Department of Justice, Margaret McIntosh, Jacques Talbot, Stephen Harapiak, and Andrew Ochterlony. Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, Douglas May and Julie Mugford. And Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions, Jeff Richstone and Mark Kilkey. Thank you all for taking the time to appear. And so 3 minutes each in the following order. We will start off with Justice, the Department of Justice. I'm not sure who's speaking, but please go ahead for 3 minutes.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. My name is Margaret McIntosh. I'm in the Aboriginal Law Centre in the Department of Justice. I'm joined today by several colleagues from departmental legal services units with expertise in various aspects of the laws, policies, and programs that this committee will be examining in relation to the challenges with enforcement of First Nation laws and bylaws. I'm pleased to be sharing opening remarks with officials from Indigenous Services Canada, Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, and the Public Prosecution Service of Canada. Gaps in enforcement have been highlighted during the COVID-19 pandemic when First Nations looked for measures to protect their communities. While many First Nations took direct action to ensure the safety of their communities during the pandemic, uncertainty with respect to enforcement has had adverse impacts on the safety and well-being of Indigenous peoples. Gaps associated with enforcement are not limited, however, to the COVID-19 context. Enforcement issues vary significantly across First Nations and reflect a complex landscape of different governance models, access to health and social services, traditions and cultures, relationships with federal and provincial governments, as well as financial resources. For instance, some communities experience challenges in enforcing Indian Act bylaws related to drugs and alcohol, leading to serious social problems on reserve. Other communities face difficulties with the enforcement of eviction laws pursuant to the First Nation Lands Management Act, forcing them to seek costly private prosecutions. Additionally, many First Nations seek the development of approaches that restore their traditional laws and legal traditions that may require new approaches to enforcement than those currently available under the criminal justice system. The federal government has an important role to play in this area. However, making significant progress requires extensive cooperation between First Nations, provinces, and federal governments, given the complexity of the issues and the number of players involved. Long-term solutions must be grounded in Indigenous self-governance and leave room for flexibility to reflect the diverse realities, experiences, and circumstances of individual communities. Likewise, provinces are necessary partners given the shared jurisdiction over administration of justice, as well as the need to facilitate coordination against justice processes in Canada. At the federal level, the Minister of Government has responsibility shared with the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness in the areas of policing and corrections for the federal policy on administration of justice, including with respect to Indigenous peoples. Recognizing that Justice Canada can play a helpful coordinating role in this area, we've been seeking opportunities to work with Indigenous nations, federal departments, and interested provinces, including Ontario and BC. On January 15th, the Minister of Justice received a supplementary mandate letter in which he was tasked with the development of an Indigenous justice strategy in consultation and cooperation with a number of federal ministers, provinces, territories, and Indigenous partners. While we're still in the early days in the work on developing this strategy, which will require extensive engagement with Indigenous peoples, we believe it could also provide an opportunity for discussions on the enforcement of First Nation bylaws and laws with First Nation leaders and partners. At the community level, Justice Canada is also exploring how we can better support Indigenous communities. The negotiation of administration of justice agreements provides a potential forward-looking response to this demand. These tailor-made or standalone administration of justice agreements could provide practical, on-the-ground solutions and incubation of innovative approaches that could be part of longer-term solutions to address enforcement and prosecution gaps. In closing, Justice Canada is committed to working with First Nations, provinces, and federal departments, since a coordinated and focused approach will be necessary to resolve the gap in enforcement and prosecution of First Nation bylaws and laws. Thank you. My colleagues and I will be pleased to respond to members' questions.
Thank you very much. Next, we go to Department of Public Safety. Douglas May, Julie Mugford, who will speak. Please go ahead.
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. My name is Julie Mugford. I'm a Senior Director in the Crime Preventions, Corrections, Criminal Justice, and Aboriginal Policing Policy Directorate within Public Safety. My responsibility lies in the area of policy relating to the First Nations Policing Program. And today I'm pleased to be accompanied by colleagues Douglas May from the Emergency Management and Programs Branch of Public Safety, as well as our Legal Services, Jacques Talbot. I recognize how important the effective enforcement and prosecution of laws on First Nations reserves is for advancing self-determination, and also understand that closing the enforcement and prosecution gaps is required for a true nation-to-nation relationship. The current patchwork of overlapping interests and responsibilities in relation to First Nation laws and bylaws between federal government departments, provinces, territories, and First Nation communities themselves, however, has led to challenges in their enforcement and prosecution. Making progress on this matter requires effort by many partners, including representatives in the federal, provincial, territorial, and First Nation governments. Policing in First Nation communities is a shared interest beyond just the federal government. Provinces and territories are key partners in this area and have jurisdiction over the administration of justice. Although Public Safety Canada does not have a direct mandate regarding the enforcement of laws or their prosecution, we do have a role to play regarding how they may be enforced by police services when relevant in their role as a result of our First Nations policing program, which invests in Indigenous policing as well as with contract policing that allows provinces and municipalities to retain the services of the RCMP as a provincial or local police force. As mentioned, the administration of justice, including policing, is an area of provincial jurisdiction. However, Public Safety Canada works with provinces, territories, and municipalities through contract RCMP policing services to ensure the effective administration and management of police services agreements. Public Safety is responsible for the First Nations policing program. This program is cost-shared with provinces and territories, most of which also hold agreements with Canada for the delivery of provincial and territorial police services by the RCMP, with the exception of Ontario and Quebec. The Government of Canada recognizes the need to strengthen and expand culturally responsive policing in Indigenous communities. This is evidenced by Minister Blair's mandate commitment and the recent funding commitment announced in Budget 2021, which announced $861 million over 5 years, beginning in 2021-22, and $145 million ongoing to support culturally responsive policing and community safety services in Indigenous communities. This includes $43.7 million over 5 years to co-develop a legislative framework for First Nations policing that recognizes First Nation policing as an essential service. $540.3 million over 5 years and $126.8 million ongoing to support Indigenous communities currently served under the First Nations policing program and to expand the program to new Indigenous communities. $108.6 million over 5 years to repair, renovate, and replace policing facilities in First Nation and Inuit communities, $64.6 million over 5 years, and $18.1 million ongoing to enhance Indigenous-led crime prevention strategies and community safety services, and $103.8 million over 5 years for Indigenous Services Canada that supports a new Pathways to Safe Indigenous Communities initiative to support Indigenous communities in developing more holistic, community-based safety and wellness models. To advance this important work, collaboration, engagement with First Nation communities and organizations, provinces and territories, police organizations, and others is crucial. We know that we have a lot of work ahead of us. It's very important, and we are looking forward to advancing this very important mandate commitment. Again, I thank you for inviting me to speak today and am available for subsequent questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we go to the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions. Who would like to go ahead?
Yes, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Jeff Richstone. I'm the Director General and Senior General Counsel at the HQ Legal Section of the Public Prosecution Service of Canada, the PPSC. I'm accompanied this morning by my colleague, Mr. Mark Kilkey, who is General Counsel within our group. I'll begin by speaking in general terms about our law and mandate. Mr. Kilkey will then talk about the protocol that we have adopted in order to assist Indigenous communities in dealing with the pandemic. Pursuant to the Director of Public Prosecutions Act, the PPSC is an independent federal entity that initiates and conducts federal prosecutions on behalf of the Attorney General of Canada. There has existed for many years a gap with respect to the prosecution of Indigenous community laws. Indigenous community laws are enacted by communities under a number of law-making authorities, but the common theme is the nation-to-nation relationship that Indigenous communities share with Canada. The prosecution of these laws is not part of PPSC's mandate. Essentially, our function is to conduct prosecutions of federal statutes on behalf of the Attorney General of Canada. Reconciling the unique law-making authorities of Indigenous communities with the traditional criminal justice system is a complex issue engaging the mandates of several federal departments, provincial and territorial governments, as well as Indigenous communities themselves. Despite our limited statutory role, PPSC is committed to working with partners to explore options and develop long-term solutions to address this issue. To that end, prior to the pandemic, PPSC was in the early stages of initiating discussions with other stakeholders to explore opportunities to bring this issue to the forefront in the hope of identifying solutions to fit the needs of Indigenous communities. I will now let my colleague, Mr. Kilkey, continue our preliminary statement. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Here is Mr. Kilkey.
Mr. Chair, in light of the urgent need presented by the COVID-19 pandemic, and in particular a situation brought to our attention in Saskatchewan, PPSC has agreed to conduct the prosecution of violations of bylaws passed pursuant to the Indian Act and which are directly related to addressing the COVID-19 pandemic. This initiative is being limited to Indian Act bylaws in order to ensure that PPSC has the legal jurisdiction required to conduct these prosecutions. This arrangement can be instituted upon an Indigenous community requesting that PPSC conduct these prosecutions and entering into a protocol agreement which makes clear that proceedings are being conducted on behalf of the Government of Canada. This protocol, and in particular the wording in relation to proceedings conducted on behalf of the Government of Canada, is required in order to give PPSC jurisdiction to prosecute. In addition, PPSC will only prosecute those bylaws that have been reviewed to ensure that they comply with the Indian Act as well as the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The PPSC will provide legal advice in respect of investigation and prosecution of these Indian Act bylaws to the applicable law enforcement agency, whether that be an Indigenous community's own police service, provincial police, or the RCMP, as the case may be. Currently, PPSC has entered into 11 such protocol agreements with communities in BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario. We are just now starting to see charges referred to as under these bylaws, and we are currently also in discussion with several communities in various other parts of the country. To be clear, this is a temporary measure and is not in any way meant to represent a solution to the broader issue of who should prosecute Indigenous community laws and the process that should be followed in doing so. This measure is not being imposed on any community, and it is not meant to displace arrangements that may already be in place to prosecute community bylaws or to prosecute provincial laws that may apply in a given community. I will now turn back to Mr. Ridgestone for some concluding remarks.
Merci.
Thank you. Solutions to the broader issue of bylaw prosecution will have to be developed through cooperation between policy leaders in federal, provincial, and Indigenous governments. PPSC looks forward to participating in these future discussions where they relate directly to our mandate. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And thank you very much. And next, to conclude our witness testimony, we have the Department of Indigenous Services. Mr. Duchesne, who will take that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's Stephen Traynor with Indigenous Services Canada, and I will begin our opening remarks. Thank you, everyone, for inviting Indigenous Services Canada to appear before you today. As noted, my name is Stephen Traynor, and I'm the Director General for Lands and Environmental Management. With me today was supposed to be Christopher Duchesne and Jacques Boutin, and colleagues from our Legal Services Unit. Hopefully, they'll join us soon. The department recognizes that enforcement and prosecution of First Nation laws and bylaws is an area of growing concern for communities. We acknowledge that this concern has been amplified across the country in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. We want to echo our colleagues' point that this issue is a shared responsibility where each of us plays a role along the enforcement continuum. ISC works collaboratively to build capacity for First Nations to develop their own laws and bylaws. For instance, under the Indian Act and Framework Agreement on First Nations land management. With respect to Indian Act bylaws, while recognizing much remains unaddressed, we understand that in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, the RCMP and the Public Prosecution Service of Canada have committed to work with communities to enter into agreements to support the enforcement and prosecution of Indian Act bylaws. ISC ministerial oversight and disallowance powers under Section 82 of the Indian Act were removed in December 2014 to allow First Nations to exercise more autonomy over their governance. However, in the spirit of cooperation, ISC continues to review draft bylaws from First Nation communities for comment only, and only when specifically requested by a First Nation. However, the decision to enact and the final content of the bylaw remain the responsibility of the band. In terms of funding for policing, enforcement, and prosecution, the department has supported other government departments and agencies in their work to pursue policing agreements and to continue supporting the administration of justice. Its role has generally been to support First Nations bylaw development through training, draft review, and field support. I would like to turn to First Nations land management. ISC, through partnership with the Lands Advisory Board and Resource Center, provides significant support to participating First Nations to develop their own land codes to reassert jurisdiction over their reserve lands and environment. The Framework Agreement and the First Nation Land Management Act provide robust enforcement and prosecution powers to communities. That said, as First Nations reassert their jurisdiction and develop their own laws to govern their lands and environment, participating communities also play a key role in determining how they want to enforce these laws and prosecute offenses. In recent years, we have seen First Nations communities taking a leadership role on these issues, and I hope the committee will hear from them in the coming weeks. A leadership example, which I would like to highlight today, include in British Columbia, the Comox First Nation set a precedent in 2018 by successfully undertaking a private prosecution of a trespass offense under their land code. In Saskatchewan, Musqueam and Whitecap Dakota First Nations have entered into an MOU with the government of Saskatchewan to work together to explore approaches to address the enforcement and prosecution of First Nations laws and bylaws. In addition, a national online conversation on enforcement of Indigenous laws has been led by the First Nations Land Management Resource Centre, supported by ISK in collaboration with the Department of Justice, the RCMP, and Public Safety. The conversation is a series of enforcement webinars promoting dialogue between Indigenous governments, provinces, and the Government of Canada on how to address the challenges of creating effective and affordable enforcement systems for Indigenous laws. Enforcement and prosecution of First Nation laws and bylaws is a complex and multifaceted issue that requires our collective effort to move the agenda forward. ISK will continue to work with federal, provincial, and First Nations partners to better understand the challenges and opportunities related to supporting effective enforcement. We look forward to the contribution of this committee in advancing this work. Thank you. Merci, Miigwech.
Thank you all for excellent opening testimony remarks. I know our committee is eager to get to questions. 6-minute round begins with Mr. Schmale, Mr. Batiste, Madam Berube, Ms. Blaney. Jamie, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, everyone. Such great expertise on this panel today, so I'm excited to get started here. I want to talk to an issue that is related to Indigenous policing, and given that our study is exploring a whole bunch of options, something that is personally of interest to me is restorative justice. So I think my first question is to Ms. Mugford, but I'll also open it up to the floor because there might be other areas, other departments here that want to speak to it. I have a whole series of questions, so if we can, we'll maybe try to keep the answers tight here. I guess Ms. Mugford, if it is, in fact, I start with you. Can you or someone on the panel provide a brief understanding of what restorative justice is with respect to Indigenous peoples and what role Indigenous peoples have in that process?
Thank you very much for your question. Unfortunately, restorative justice falls out of my area of expertise. I would look to my colleagues who are also on the call today, and failing that, we will also supply some written response to your question.
Is anyone else able to answer that question? I have a hand up.
Please go ahead. Ms. McIntosh.
I will just speak to the idea of restorative justice with respect to the work that the Department of Justice is doing with administration of justice agreements with First Nations. I spoke about it in my opening statements, but this is where we are exploring options with Indigenous communities for their own priorities in the area of justice. And very often it's in the form of restorative justice, which is more a traditional form of justice, and where they're seeking an off-ramp from the criminal justice system, or they wish to enforce their own laws. So I don't know if that's of assistance, but we're certainly doing a lot of work in that area.
Yeah, that does. That's helpful. I don't know if anyone else wants to answer quickly before I jump to my next one. I don't see any other hands up, although I see a hand up here. Jeff Richstone, I think.
Yep, go ahead.
Yes, I just say that, of course, the Department, the Public Prosecution Service is as well involved in restorative justice initiatives, both in the territories north of 60 and south. We have an internal committee looking at the interaction of Indigenous people with the justice system, and our policies are under revision right now. But we do have active initiatives and projects in the north of 60.
Perfect. And in the models that we're seeing, is there a role for not only police officers and maybe elders within the community to help in this process? Are you seeing that in the models that are available and working?
If you're talking to me, the answer is yes.
You or anyone else?
Well, the answer is yes. There is that. We actively involve elders and the police in those initiatives.
Okay, and what functions do they play? Are they?
Well, they're part of well, let's talk about. I'm sure you're aware of the Gladue sentencing principles and the framework there. Well, we have a desk book chapter on that, and in the desk book chapter, it's set out. There's a framework to set up how we carry out those consultations. So it's quite, and it's, I don't want to be too optimistic and say it's always working, but it's something that we're working on and something we're developing with the communities. And it's as you can imagine, a work in progress. But it's certainly a positive development, and it's something that we're committed to.
Yeah, if it matters, just the feedback I'm getting from Indigenous communities I'm speaking with are very supportive of this path, and so I'm glad to hear your comments on that. I appreciate that. In a report in 2020 found on the public safety website, the increasing use of restorative justice in criminal matters in Canada, there were a number of recommendations made, specifically recommendation number 5, that a national dialogue on best practices and standardization where possible regarding data collection be established. It's not clear if that includes Indigenous communities as well. I'm guessing that it does, but could maybe the Public Safety Department confirm that? And if that is the case regarding Indigenous communities, if you could maybe update this committee on the work that's been done to date.
Again, apologies. I am not sure of the what is all included, but I will get back to you and advise on that.
Okay, Chair, I see you getting ready to jump in here. I'm assuming my time is up. You're muted, Chair. You have to unmute, Chair.
Okay.
There you go.
It's a tech. I have great problems. Since the age of steam has ended, I'm having problems with the newer digital era. So
I'm just bugging you, Chair.
Okay. Mr. Batiste. Jaime, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for this study. I think it's very important that we look at enforcement and policing on communities. You know, during COVID, I received many calls from many chiefs all across Canada that talked about we have the ability under the Indian Act to look out for our communities under Indian Act sections for bylaws for the enforcement of noxious diseases, and they were making bylaws in order to keep their communities safe. Yet they were told that, in many cases, the police in their area would not help them enforce that. And I'm trying to figure out why a mandate was needed where there's something directly within an Indian Act that says that the chief and council has responsibility over something, and when they make a law to enforce that, that they didn't receive any help. And I had myself made calls to RCMP and wondered what was the holdup. So I understand from Ms. Mugford, you said there's no direct mandate from the federal government, but doesn't the Indian Act provide that mandate for the enforcement of some laws on reserve?
Thank you for the question. And again, I would say that the enforcement of laws, I'm looking at the First Nations policing program more from a policy perspective rather than the operationalization. And the enforcement of laws is more of an operational issue. And in terms of enforcement, it is done on by the police of jurisdiction. And I think that would be a question that would better be handled by the RCMP. And I believe you would be speaking with them at a subsequent meeting date.
Yes, and so I've spoken to the RCMP, and they've basically indicated that there was nothing to do. I'm trying to figure out what kind of mandate is needed from the federal government to enable to enforce laws that are already recognized within the Indian Act as chief and counsel's responsibility, and what's the obstacle for the local enforcement officers, whether it's provincial or RCMP or communities, in enforcing those laws. Anyone can step in and answer this question. Okay, let me try something else. How often, I know there's very different departments on this, and I'm trying to figure out how often do you guys collaborate to speak about how we can better serve enforcement on reserve and prosecution of chief and counsels? Anyone?
McIntosh?
I think all of the departments that are here today have mentioned the fact that collaboration is extremely important. And as a matter of fact, we have different groups at different levels within our organizations, and we meet frequently. We also work often with our Indigenous colleagues. So I think in response, we are aware of the issues. We're working internally, and we're working with our external colleagues on a regular basis in trying to respond to these issues. So it's certainly not something that we're not aware of. They're just difficult questions, and many, many players involved, including provinces.
Okay, I understand that as I come from reserve. I see someone else's hand up. Can you quickly on that one?
Yes. So one of the issues we've been working on is, in conjunction with our colleagues over at PPSC, of course, is the protocol agreements. And we've been reviewing some of the draft bylaws, of course, at the request of First Nations, to provide them some guidance and to assist. And those are the bylaws that are being enforced. So without the power of disapproval, some of the problems that can come up is whether a bylaw is within the scope of the authority of the Indian Act, or whether it is charter compliant as required since 2011. And so those are some of the concerns. But we would need particular bylaws to give you a definitive answer as to why a particular bylaw could not be enforced.
Can you give me a sense of the timelines of how a community passes a bylaw, and what's the ultimate determination in terms of whether it's in compliance?
Well, that's for the First Nation itself to determine. Prior to 2014, of course, under Section 82 of the Indian Act, all bylaws had to be submitted to the minister for review, and there was a power of disallowance. So if the bylaws were not charter compliant, the minister would typically disallow them at that point. Since that power has been removed, the minister has less control, or has no oversight authority over those bylaws. So it's up to the First Nation to determine the content of those bylaws, and they no longer have to submit them to the department for review or approval or disapproval or any process like that.
1 minute, Jaime.
I guess my question wasn't how the process on the reserve works, because I'm familiar with that process. My question is, once the community has determined this is a bylaw, where does it go next? Now, I understand that it doesn't go to the minister now, which I think is a good step. So how does it get to the point where they can get a review and get enforcement of that, and the timelines?
Well, there's a requirement that the bylaw be published under Section 86 of the Indian Act. And once it's published and comes into force, it would presumably be enforceable.
That will pretty much take our time, Jaime. Thank you. Madam Berube, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm on the Anishinaabe Territory, province of Quebec, so I'd like to thank all of the witnesses for appearing here today. My question is as follows, and it's for Mr. Traynor. Earlier, you talked about concerning issues with respect to the pandemic, with the funding of the police forces on the communities. You talked about the challenges you had in enforcing First Nations law. Could you go into this in detail, please?
Thank you very much. With regard to funding, we do provide some funding through an operational funding formula through the First Nations Land Management Act that do allow for some notional amount for enforcement and prosecution. It is not up to us to determine how that is spent on reserve with regard to those activities, but we provide some moderate capacity for the communities to use it as they see fit, and it's up to them to sort out their best solution in terms of how they will deal with a flexible community approach in terms of enforcing and identify any issues with regard to that aspect.
Is it difficult to enforce other types of laws on the reserves? For example, the criminal code, is it difficult to enforce?
That's something I would have to defer to another department, as generally we work with the communities, provide some funding for their band base to be able to operate, and some amount of monies for the First Nations land management. Those other aspects I'd have to defer to my colleagues if they have a response on that item.
Est-ce que quelqu'un peut répondre?
Could someone answer that question, please?
No.
C'est bon.
Okay. Mr. Talbot? Generally speaking, the police forces enforce the criminal code on reserves, whether it be provincial police, such as the Quebec Police Force, or the RCMP, or the OPP, or the actual indigenous police force. But it's a problem when we go beyond the role of a police force. There are certain bylaws of the band which do not fall under the purview of the police force, just as certain municipal bylaws or certain regulations made by the federal government or the provincial government are not enforced by police forces. But I would invite you to, to ask this question of the chief of the Police Association for First Nations or the RCMP. They would be in a better position to answer your question. I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much. I also had a question for Mr. Richstone. Given that the COVID-19 study that was done on First Nations, what difficulties did you have to enforce administrative laws during the pandemic? And are you trying to, what we did, Madam Berube, was we undertook a pilot project, and we thought about doing something pre-pandemic, but we set up this pilot project in order to deal with the crisis itself. The protocol is one that that can be renewed as events arise. Mr. Kilkey, do you want to add anything to what I've said with respect to the protocol?
No, I'm good with that. Thanks.
Okay. Est-ce que je sais pas si ça...
Does that answer your question, Ms. Berube? Pardon me. Do you know if the communities prefer administrative of justice agreements after the pandemic? I have no answer to that, but what I was told, or what I said in my opening statement, is that we would be engaged. We'd like to be engaged in any type of long-term solution. We are one intervener, not the only one, and should there be an interesting proposal or productive for the communities, we will work with our partners to try to come to an arrangement that's more long-term. But you know very well that we're talking about a lot of communities here. There are more than 600 First Nations, so the arrangements that may be attractive to one group will not be for another. So we have to be somewhat creative in coming up with these solutions.
Much. And Ms. Blaney, 6 minutes, please go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you all of you for being here to testify today. I found your testimony very informative and I really appreciate it. I will start my questions by making a statement that I will reassure you I don't need any of you to respond to, which is this is a serious form, in my opinion, of systemic racism because the systems are so confusing, so convoluted all over the place, and the people that are paying for it are Indigenous communities across Canada. And that's not a personal attack. I think it's something that we should all reflect on. The fact that these systems are in place, the way that they are in place, are devastating to communities. I remember being a foster parent on reserve and trying to get the police to make sure that the child in my care was protected was absolutely impossible because the jurisdiction of the restraining order was provincial and we were on federal. It's so complex. So I want to acknowledge that it is really complex. Mr. Kilkey, you talked about protocol agreements that are agreements with Indigenous communities around prosecution. I'm just wondering if any of those are public and if that's something that the committee could look at.
I will have to check on that. We have 11 of them to date, and they are agreements directly with the community itself and the police of local jurisdiction, but I will certainly look into that.
That would be so appreciated. Thank you so much. And Mr. Richton, if I could come to you, you talked earlier about prior to COVID, working with key stakeholders around identifying solutions regarding prosecution. I'm just wondering if you could sort of outline, was that with a particular region? Was it all across Canada? And who were the stakeholders?
When we're talking about stakeholders, and particularly at the federal level, with federal government stakeholders, because as you may know, Madam Member of Parliament, the issue of what kind of jurisdiction the Public Prosecution Service or the federal Crown has with respect to Indian Act bylaws is something that was very much a question that had to be thought through and clarified. And we, with the assistance and in collaboration with our federal partners, we clarified our mandate to the extent we felt that we could offer and propose as I said, this pilot project with respect to the pandemic. In respect of the limited mandate that we have given to us by both the Director of Public Prosecutions Act on the one hand and the Criminal Code on the other. And so this is how we tried to design something that we thought could work.
Thank you. I really appreciate that testimony. So I do see that there's a lot of resources in the 2021 budget. We had them read out to us, so I appreciate that. I'm just wondering, and I leave this, please just unmute and respond if you are the person to answer the question. So one of the things that I'm concerned about is, what does declaring First Nations policing essential service mean? So I need clarity on that. There are some nations that have their own police, and there's other nations that have partnerships and agreements with other organizations, or with other police or RCMP. So I'm just wondering, what does essential service, what does that mean, making it an essential service?
Hi, thank you for that question. And I would also invite any colleagues to provide comment afterwards. But basically, as we try to co-develop legislation that looks at First Nations policing as an essential service, that's one of the things that we do want to look with and work with partners at defining and better understanding. But
so you don't know, does it mean ongoing funding? Like, I sort of associated it directly with funding that comes every year, so it's something that nobody has to fight for.
Currently, you're correct. Currently, the program is grants and contributions, discretionary funding, and it has been oversubscribed for a period of time. So there is pressure on the funds available. So what we are looking to do is remove that discretionary nature. But again, we do want to work. We don't want to impose a system on folks, but we want to work in collaboration and co-develop what it means.
Thank you. So the other thing is these funding resources are there. I'm just wondering how much money is actually dedicated to building capacity within First Nations communities to develop policing skills or expertise? Because one of the challenges, of course, is you've got leaders that are doing everything that a federal government does, that a municipal government does, and a provincial government does within their own community. And then on top of that, we're asking them to figure out how to navigate a complex system of policing. And so I'm just wondering, how much of these resources are actually going to go into the community to say, here's some money to help you have the resources to actually figure this out? Can someone answer that question?
A minute, go ahead.
Hi, this is Stephen Trainer, Indigenous Services Canada. To let you know, with regard to the funding, I can speak to the very limited capacity we provide under the First Nations Land Management Act. I don't have the full total amount, but certainly in 2018, we have an operational funding formula that allows communities to receive funding for their policy analysts for lands, but we also have a small amount of funding for an enforcement officer under that act. And it's up to the community to determine how best they're going to utilize it and based on what flexibility they're going to have in terms of how they're going to enforce it. But
Thank you. And the problem is, of course, that our CMP police often don't think they can enforce it. So they do all of that work. And then the communities get our CMP police coming to their community saying, sorry, we can't do anything. And I know that's what all of you are hearing. Thank you for my time.
Thanks very much, Ms. Blaney. And we go now to the 5-minute round of questioning. And we'll start with Mr. Viersen, Ms. DeMoff. Arnold, please go ahead. 5.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank my witnesses, or all the witnesses, for coming here today. Appreciate their time. Just around enforcement, enforcement is a part of justice. Equal enforcement is important, regardless of the situation, if the enforcement happens in the same. And then the other part about it is just the time of from enforcement to prosecution. Those are important pieces of justice. And something that I notice in my vast riding that I represent is that the time from an infraction or an enforcement to the time where it's resolved sometimes can take years, and sometimes takes place, the prosecution takes place hundreds of kilometers away from where the infraction took place. And all of those things don't necessarily lead to a community that functions, mostly because of the timing of there doesn't seem to be justice because, well, here's an incident, we tried to enforce it, there's infraction and fines or charges laid, and then 2 years later it's somewhat resolved, but everybody's forgotten about it at that time. I think I'll start with you, Mr. Trainer, just around, I'm not as familiar with the First Nations Land Management Act and how that works, but if there is an infraction and there's enforcement on it, how long does that take to be kind of resolved typically?
I would not be in a position to let you know. I'd have to go back and see if I can find out, but generally it's up to the flexibility of how the system is operated by the choice of the community. So it would depend on what the community chooses on how it's going to manage that and which services it provides. So you'd be better placed to ask either the policing on reserve or somebody, others from the community who would better be able to respond to that for you.
Okay. This is always one of the interesting things that happens with reserve lands, is justice a Indigenous service, or is justice a responsibility of the Justice Department? Mr. Trainer, I'm going to start with you again on that, and then I'll turn over to the Justice Department.
I'd have to defer to our Justice Department to respond to that question. Thank you.
Okay. Is that Mr. Kilkey? Mrs. McIntosh?
I think you said the words discrimination. Is that the element that you're
No, I'm just it's always an interesting thing for me, just when it comes to reserve lands or people that live on reserve. Is justice a responsibility of Indigenous Services Canada, or is it a responsibility of the Justice Department of Canada? That's it. Like, are you following what I'm trying to ask there? But like, is the like, to some degree, I would like to see courts and tribunals happening on the reserve so that we don't have to go far away to resolve some of these issues, and then also that we could speed up the entire process. Does Justice Canada, the Justice Department of Canada, do they see that as their responsibility, or do they see that as Indigenous Services responsibility? Like, which department does that fall into?
I think every federal department that's represented today has a little piece of the picture here. That's part of the problem, that there's so many different players and so many issues. This is, I've already talked about administration of justice agreements, where we're trying to fix some of these problems by working with Indigenous, individual First Nations to bring together all the players to the table. We have the opportunity to develop tribunals on reserve, or to enhance enforcement and prosecution issues on individual reserves. But it is a very complex system. The provinces are very much involved as well. And the police forces are a key to resolving these issues.
Mr. Kilkey,
that will do it. 10 seconds. Thanks, Mr. Vierson. We go to Mr. Pawlowski, 5 minutes.
Okay, so I, like everyone else, find this very complicated. So my understanding is laws of general applicability apply on reserves. And although criminal code is federal jurisdiction in generally speaking, it's the province which prosecutes criminal code offenses, right? So this isn't under the PPSC, and it isn't normally federal prosecutors who would prosecute criminal code offenses on reserve.
That's correct, sir. Except if it's north of 60. Because there are no reserves north of 60, so.
Now, you talked about the prosecution of bylaws under the Indian Act and the problems with doing so. And now my understanding is that you've worked out a process where you can prosecute those, but first of all, you have to review those bylaws for constitutionality, and you have to come up with an agreement with the First Nations before you enforce those, right? And this, in my understanding, this is a new process.
Mr. Kilkey, wouldn't it you?
That's right.
So I'm a little.
That's right. It's a new process and just in place for the pandemic.
So I'm a little confused here. In that the Indian Act, I think, was 1876. It's been 145 years since it was written. I know it's been amended numerous times. However, I would think the provisions related to control of infectious disease were in there from the beginning. So what's been happening in 145 years? They've just been sitting there unprosecuted for 145 years?
I won't pretend that there isn't a gap. There is a gap that's existed for decades, and we recognize that gap. And before the pandemic came upon us, we had undertaken to work with our partners to find solutions. The solution that we have in place now is very much a stopgap approach, a risk-managed approach, and we still need a broader solution that brings in together the various partners, including very much the provinces, both the provincial attorneys general, provincially appointed police officers, and frankly, the provincial courts, where these offenses have to be prosecuted.
Now, these new agreements, I've spoken to Chief Peter Collins of Fort William First Nations numerous times since the beginning of the pandemic, and he's repeatedly voiced his frustrations with the inability to enforce bylaws he's made under the Indian Act. I would suggest, and perhaps I'm wrong, the fact that the bands, First Nations, can make these agreements with PPSC isn't something that's broadly known among the chiefs. What has your ministry done in order to inform the chiefs that this is an option that is open to them? Because as I say, they don't seem to know, and this is the first time I've heard anything about this.
And I'm not surprised by that. We are not reaching out. We don't have that capacity. We are not a typical department with that kind of outreach or programs. We are here to act on behalf of the Attorney General. We're a very small department. We've put this in place knowing that it's not perfect and doing it when we are approached by communities. But no, we have not issued a blanket communication strategy to let people know that this is available. We're doing it through word of mouth, primarily through the RCMP.
And I guess the last thing you said that these bylaws have to be reviewed first to make sure they can do this under the terms of the Indian Act, that these bylaws are constitutional. Now, I think a lot of municipal bylaws are made by municipalities, and the power is delegated to them by the province to make the bylaws. Are these subject to the same requirement that before somebody's going to prosecute those bylaws, that some parent organization has to review those bylaws and make sure that they're constitutional?
Just briefly.
I can't speak to that because we don't prosecute municipal bylaws. We prosecute federal statutes on behalf of the Attorney General of Canada, and we're looking for the same kind of review that all federal bills, federal legislation goes through before it goes to Parliament, so that we can be applying the same standard on behalf of the Attorney General that we do in all the other situations where we prosecute.
Thank you very much for the answer.
If I can add,
I'm sorry, we're right out of time, Marcus. Moving on to Madame Bérubé, 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question pertains to perhaps the First Nations Police Association. But we had talked about self-government and protection of lands. What training do the police members on First Nations have? What type of training do Indigenous police officers get?
Someone?
Hi, thank you for your Douglas May with Public Safety Canada. The training that First Nations officers get are, well, it depends on the kind of, I guess, a model or agreement by which the First Nation is subject to. If it is a community tripartite model, which is where essentially the RCMP is the police of jurisdiction, then that training is done through the RCMP, depot, etc. If it is through a self-administered police agreement, where the police services are authorized or established by the provincial or territorial government, it's the jurisdiction that would be responsible for that training. So, for example, in BC, it would be the Justice Institute. In Ontario, it would be DOPP, etc. It depends largely on the jurisdiction in that regard.
There have been many studies done. They talk about systemic racism. What about the police services? Is there confidence in that?
That is something that I cannot speak to. I apologize.
Anyone else? Apparently not. Sorry, Madam Bérubé. That brings us to Mr. Talbot. Did you wish to speak on that?
Just clarification, the policing agreements signed with Indigenous communities for the funding of their police services are tripartite agreements signed with the provincial governments, and they establish their requirements. And the principle here is that the Indigenous police services should get the same training as non-Indigenous police departments they also get the training that they need in terms of cultural sensitivities. And very often, the First Nations participate in establishing these programs. So there are some very interesting undertakings in Quebec, undertaken by the government of Quebec. They would be in a better position to talk about this, particularly the Nicollet Police Institute.
Sorry, we're just about out of time, so we'll go to Ms. Blaney, 2.5. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Chair. Mr. Trainer, if I could ask you a question. I'm hoping you're the right branch here. I guess for me, what I'm trying to understand a little bit more is there's been some money announced in the 2021 budget. What will be the mechanism of getting those resources for Indigenous communities and for First Nations communities? And is this something that will be like an application process? Will there be different communities will there be a rating, and what will be the criteria? Because like it's been said a few times, it is a complex multi-jurisdictional challenge. So I'm just wondering, how will it be rolled out? What kind of program? Do you know that answer at this point?
At this point in time, I'd have to get back to you on that question. I do not have any information about it, but endeavor to get that to you.
Thank you. So if I could come back to you again, Mr. Trainer, you talked about the Comox situation, and I represent Comox and know Haggis Rempo quite well. You described it as a success. So I'm just curious about that, because that nation, of course, spent $178,000 of their own resources to fight this in court, and they won. But this is one of the challenges when we talk about so many different things, that the nations themselves are having to find the way to resource this, which keeps them financially, not able to build up their own economic independence. So you're specifically around land management. I'm just wondering, what is the gap that they can make Indigenous communities, First Nations communities can do all of the work, create the bylaws, and yet when they call, they can't get those bylaws enforced. And so, I've heard a lot of stories of if they have a good relationship, if a community has a good relationship with their local RCMP, and for my riding, that is what it is, the RCMP will show up and stand there. They can't really do much, but they're there in solidarity to hope that the policing that now, Chief and Council is also taking on top of everything else. What is the gap? Why can't they enforce their own bylaws?
Very briefly.
It is certainly a long-standing challenge, and the best I could let you know is that we continue to work with the provincial governments and all our federal colleagues to sort of better understand not only the gap, but what are the challenges for reducing that gap.
Thank you very much. And members of the committee, hopefully some of the questions that were difficult to be completely answered might be in our follow-up panel. So in the interest of time and getting a fulsome committee hour in, we'll suspend for the moment, change our panels, and then return. So briefly, our committee is now suspended.
the criminal offense. I should state that the difference between Indian Act laws or bylaws, I should say, and land code is that the authority is given or transferred from Canada to First Nation land code nations to develop laws and to have those enforced. And so that's where this confusion seems to come in. So the RCMP said they could not remove Thordarson or charge them under the land code offense. They would attend and keep the peace, as our laws were not, and I quote, real laws. The Crown would not prosecute, as they didn't recognize our laws, and they did not recognize the authority that we had to create the laws. And these are not bylaws, these are laws. So Comox had a difficult decision. We had someone squatting on our land illegally, so we decided the only way forward was to charge and prosecute the offense itself via criminal code provisions, allowing for a private prosecution of a criminal offense. Unheard of. The court was baffled and unfamiliar with the land code and the authority granted to develop and enforce laws under the framework agreement of the First Nations Lands Management Act. After 10 months in court proceedings, the court eventually got to the understanding and ordered the police to remove the trespasser. This carried significant costs to Comox in legal fees for private prosecution in the ballpark of $178,000. The trespassers got 10 months of free rent and were fined $1,000 each. Hardly an equitable decision. It was an extremely costly process, and we should not have had to go to court to get that court order. Just this week, and in fact today, we have another trespasser on reserve who was issued a notice of trespass by myself and an RCMP officer 2 days ago. And we are not hopeful that he will leave. And in fact, he has dared us to take him to court. So we could potentially be looking at another costly court case. So with the court decision in Thordarson in favor of Comox, the question of enforcement should be a non-issue, and the RCMP should be there to enforce the matter. However, we've been told by the RCMP lawyer that they have not been granted that direction from higher ups within the RCMP. While our relationship with the RCMP has drastically improved due to a change in inspectors, their hands are tied at the moment with regard to enforcing laws because of the lack of direction from above. A big selling feature of the Land Code Framework Agreement is being self-governing on our reserve lands with the ability to create our own laws and have them enforced and recognized in courts, which wasn't happening under the Indian Act. Funding also remains an issue to develop laws and enforce. A secondary issue that we have is that Comox is also in the 9th year of Stage 5 treaty negotiations, and we recently held a forum on First Nation law enforcement in partnership with the BC Treaty Commission. This forum included land code nations, nations negotiating treaties, and self-governing nations, as well as police officers and representatives from the Attorney General's office, federal and provincial. What we learned was that nations such as Manalf and Tla'amin have been struggling with enforcement issues as treaty nations, and neither have successfully prosecuted a single offense under their laws. To date, the only modern treaty nation to successfully address an enforcement issue is Tsawwassen First Nation, who have a very costly enforcement agreement with the Delta Municipal Police. To be self-governing, First Nations need to have proper enforcement tools, including an adjudicative body, enforcement services, and capacity for policing, and mechanisms that harmonize with the provincial court administrative systems. We are trying to achieve the above through our land code by creating things like community protection laws and adjudication laws and a justice tribunal, and also through our treaty negotiations, because we are very close to voting on a treaty. And this is, if we're dealing with this under land code as a self-governing portion under the Indian Act, then how is this going to work out for treaty? And so far, modern day treaties only provide the first of these tools, and that is lawmaking, and that's the same with the land code. And so before closing, I just want to refer back to the enforcement forum that was hosted by Treaty Commission. This forum had a number of recommendations, and I'm happy to provide that to whomever I need to provide that to so that that can be shared. But there are a number of recommendations, including needing language in the treaty to ensure that First Nation laws under treaty can be adjudicated under First Nation Justice Tribunal. With regards to mechanics of enforcement, we need to change the treaty language and provincial law to clarify that First Nation laws are enactments for the purpose of Provincial Court Act to allow filing of a First Nations Justice Tribunal order to have it come to the order of court to trigger court enforcement mechanisms. And then regarding policing and enforcement agencies, we have tried for years to negotiate a tripartite agreement with the province of BC and the RCMP, and we've been told repeatedly they no longer do these tripartite agreements. I understand that may be changing, and I really hope it is, because these, the issues that we're facing here in Comox with drug dealers, people trespassing, I shouldn't be in these people's faces. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Sorry for interrupting. It's all important, but we want to make sure we get a full round of questioning. And Chief Blake, 6 minutes. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon. Dada Nastada, says Keith Blake Ata. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Keith Blake. I'm the Chief of Police of the Sutino Nation. I'm also an executive member of the First Nation Chiefs of Police Association and proud to represent 36 self-administered First Nation police services across our country. Firstly, I want to thank you for this opportunity. It's a critically important discussion, and our communities have been speaking long and loud in relation to this very topic. So, as this discussion relates to the enforcement of First Nations, which really falls under the police jurisdiction, I thought it would initially be important to touch on the First Nation policing program. I was fortunate enough to hear some of the other panelists, and this was a discussion point, but I thought it might be good to put it through a First Nation policing lens. The FNPP is over 35 years old and is in dire need of immediate change. The program is a signed funding agreement, in our case, a tripartite agreement between the nation, the province, and the federal governments, which unfortunately creates inequities and unfair restrictions to First Nation police services that are not experienced by the traditional mainstream policing services. The FNPP has not yet been designated as an essential service, and it falls under, as was mentioned earlier, the Grants and Contributions Program. The funding is neither long-term or sustainable, and our funding agreements, and specifically in our case, are really year-to-year extensions. This funding model truly does not allow for us to properly prepare and strategize for the community's needs in public safety. It's only funded for what also could be termed as core policing function. That's responsive models. We're not funded to have community programming, prevention, the specified and specialty units that other police services have. It's important, and I think really critical, to note that former Public Safety Minister Goodale stated the program does not cut the mustard and is in dire need of change. Our current Minister Blair stated that the FNP needs updating. Canada has a responsibility to improve First Nation policing by making it an essential service and providing adequate funding for the nations to build and sustain proper infrastructure, including governance models. This unstable funding model has really created an air of instability within our services, where our officers and our staff members don't feel, again, that this is a program that will be sustained, and therefore perhaps their profession and their jobs may not be sustained. This disparity also includes what we receive in our salaries, what we receive in our pension and benefits, and what we end up usually doing is losing our really high quality officers to more mainstream policing services that have that sustainable funding model at a higher rate. To try and sum up our First Nation police services, we are underfunded, understaffed, and face unfair barriers and impediments. Yet, we still see unprecedented successes in being effective, efficient, culturally appropriate, community-based policing. I will also state that we are very happy to hear the infusion within the last federal budget to the program, and we're guardedly optimistic that that will make some needed support and changes within the program. In speaking on the enforcement side, the enforcement role of the police that they undertake is just one important part of the structure of the justice system in our communities. There is the legislative piece, the enforcement piece, the prosecution and adjudication component. Though we recognize that not many communities have the direct ability to change the way funding and the justice systems correlate, it is important to consider the historical traumas experienced by Indigenous peoples throughout our country and for generations, while considering the ongoing harm that inadequate funding causes and the justice resources that government bodies provide. And it is to one of our most vulnerable populations within our country. Nation legislated offenses are an important aspect of self-determination. They are created from a community lens to address the individual nation's self-identification and to the specific needs of the community and the challenges that they face. A key piece of the justice framework is a prosecution of lawfully enacted nation legislation. Most jurisdictions across the country do not recognize or prosecute nation legislated offenses. The challenge most Indigenous communities face in this country is the refusal or the reluctance to have provincial crown prosecutors or federal prosecutors prosecute these nation legislations. Although this is unfortunately the situation that most communities find themselves in, there are glimmers of hope. And in that instance, I'm going to provide a brief glimpse into our Sutino Nation justice model. We have a signed agreement with the province of Alberta for what is termed our Peacemakers Court, which is very unique. Across this province, there are no other communities that do have this agreement, so we are unique. Our court is configured in a healing circle and is mandated to have an Indigenous Crown Prosecutor, an Indigenous judge, Indigenous court workers. It's also has a peacemaker that's present who oversees this process. The peacemaking process can be utilized if the offense falls under certain criteria. Some offenses are ineligible, things like manslaughter, sexual assault, and the individual can be recommended throughout the peacemaking process and can be recommended by the Crown, the judge, from defense, and it can occur anytime throughout that process, pre-charge, post-charge. The process requires the approval of the victim. It is also an agreement that the offender must enter into, and it requires the offender to appear before a peacemaking tribunal. That tribunal will consist of formally mediated, trained community members and elders. It's designed to be restorative, less punitive, and it really does look at the root causes of crime. So through this peacemaking process, it allows the ability for the justice system to address what I spoke to earlier, the root cause of crime, and also address both the criminal code offenses as well as nation legislated offenses through a traditional value system that provides a community a voice in determining what appropriate resolution may be. So although there is still many, many challenges and still much work to be done in the Indigenous communities across the country. I want to thank the committee for giving me this opportunity, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. See you guys.
Thank you, Chief. And I know we're eager to get to those questions. Mr. Vidal, you're up for 6 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank both Chief Rempel and Chief Blake for being with us today. Your testimony and knowledge and experience is very helpful as we pursue some answers to this question around policing as an essential service. The mandate letters for the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness and the Minister of Indigenous Services both refer to co-developing a legislative framework to recognize First Nations policing as essential service. In our last panel, I think, I'm not sure if you both were observing the first hour panel, but we had officials from 4 different federal departments on the panel. And if I recall, I believe it was Ms. Blaney that asked the question about defining essential services. And I'm not sure we actually got an answer to that question from the department officials. So we have this mandate that talks about policing as an essential service. And I'm not sure anybody's telling us or defining for us what that is in the kind of jurisdictional quagmire we seem to find in the federal department. So I'm going to start with Chief Blake and then Chief Rempel, if you'd be prepared to answer the same question. Would you, in your terms, would you just take a moment and define for me what defining police services in your experience at the level of work that you both do, what defining a police service as an essential service would mean as a difference in the communities that you serve?
Well, thank you. I appreciate that opportunity. And again, I'm very much wanting to understand what essential services means in the definition from Public Safety Canada and the federal government, because that hasn't been clearly defined in any of the meetings that I've attended. I think what's key and critical is to ensure that, again, we're not under a grants and contributions program, that funding cannot be sustained or secured. We need to recognize and realize that we are not asking for anything more in our funding, but we certainly don't want anything less. Our communities deserve it, and we want to ensure that our service officers and staff are treated in the same manner that other police services often take for granted. So the term essential services, I know, is something that needs to be spoken to and addressed, but I do hope it relates to sustainable long-term funding that can be secured and assured to our communities, and that there is the recognition that policing isn't just a responsive model. It needs to address the root causes of crime through crime prevention, through preventative programming, as well as to provide us opportunities to grow our police service, have those specialized units that can address the problems within our communities that we only have support through outside agencies, RCMP in provincial policing jurisdictions, the OPP, Quebec Police Service. So that's just some of my comments, and thank you for that.
Thank you, Chief Rempel. If you want to add your comment to that question, and then I will have one more for you, hopefully, if the chair gives me time.
Certainly. And thank you to Chief Blake for those comments. I echo those as well. I would just add recognition of authority from the RCMP as well as the courts, the provincial courts. Our people expect the same services as the general population, and we are not getting that response from the RCMP or from the courts. Funding as well, if First Nations enforcement is an option to create our own First Nations authority, I think that would be wonderful and maybe alleviate some of the issues that we are having. But I would really like to hear the federal and provincial definition of essential services as well. Thank you.
I appreciate that from both of you. I'm going to follow up again with just another question down that same line. But so we talk about this, or the federal government talks about this co-development process. I'm just curious if in your roles, Chief Blake, in your role with the association, and Chief Rempel in your role as the chief of First Nation, if you know of people within your organizations or colleagues or people kind of equal peers that have been involved at all or been asked to be involved in the co-development of this process.
Well, thank you. I can advise you that the First Nation Chiefs of Police did have a teleconference with Public Safety Minister Blair last week, and we discussed initially how that might look and what's required. Previous to that, I know the AFN were involved in that framework discussions, and I do think what I really hope happens is the SMEs, the subject matter experts in First Nation policing, are at the table to discuss the challenges, the successes, the framework that's so vitally important, because without those consultations, I don't think it will be the success that everyone's hoping it can be.
Thank you. And Chief Rempel, my question, I want to be a little bit more specific with you. I'm curious if you're aware of any chiefs at the local level that have been asked to be involved with this process.
No, I am not currently aware of any. I would certainly like to participate in that and have that opportunity. I do think it's important, to note that the AFN, while they provide a great service to First Nations, does not accurately, in my opinion, represent every First Nation. And so reliance on engaging with these larger groups doesn't necessarily mean that they're representing my nation. And so nation to nation discussions are also critically important, in my opinion.
And I suspect in your conversation with your peers that I might hear that same answer from many of them. Would that be fair in your opinion?
For sure, yes.
Thank you. I think, Mr. Chair, I'm pretty close there. I'll cede the rest of my time.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Van Couverden, 6 minutes, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thanks to both of our witnesses in this hour for providing your very valuable insight and perspective on this. Chief Rempel, Vice President Blake, really appreciate you being here today. Thank you. My question is focusing on the path forward and the next 3 to 5 years. But Budget 2021 proposes to provide almost $1 billion over the next 5 years, and in particular over $500 million to support Indigenous communities currently served under the First Nations Policing Program, to expand that program to new communities. In addition to that, there's over $100 million to repair and renovate and replace a lot of the policing facilities that have no doubt worn the test of time in First Nation and Inuit communities in Canada. And in addition to that, over $100 million over the next 5 years for New Pathways to Safe Indigenous Communities initiative, and to develop a more holistic and community-based safety and wellness models. Given that you would like and do deserve deep consultation on these expenditures and investments in Indigenous communities, I would love to hear your reflections on how these investments would and potentially could positively impact your communities and better outcomes for your constituencies, and any recommendations you have. Vice President Blake, I see you're off mute, so I'd ask you to go first and provide enough time that Chief Rempel would also be able to reflect. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for this opportunity. I can speak from experience in the past is, of course, the program itself depends upon our federal and provincial funding partners, the 52% from our federal partners, the 48 from our provincial. So the problem with this type of funding is that if one doesn't have that 52 or 48, we just don't get it. And so again, provincially, we're facing some challenges in the province of Alberta. I don't know if their 48 would be available to us. The other challenge that I've seen in the past is it pits our First Nation police services against each other. We're vying for all the dollars that are available, and I think we're all in dire need of that money. So again, it's about the best business case, or really it's not the way that I would like to see it. I would like to see evaluations that are more objective, that provide us all accessibility to the funds that are needed. And again, it is welcomed, and we are guardedly optimistic that we'll make differences. But ultimately, just to give you some perspective, our service received an additional resource 2 years ago. Prior to that, it was 12 years before we had any funding for an additional resource. That's far too long, and you can, I'm sure, appreciate the fact that for that period of time, we needed growth. And our communities are the fastest growing communities in Canada, and we have the largest youth population, which needs preventative programming, prevention, and engagement. And it's hard to do it when all you're doing is responding to calls. So thank you.
Thank you, Vice President Blake. And having worked a lot on the sport side, both on the Indigenous sport side and with Sport Canada, I can reiterate how competitive the application process is between sports. I see some similarities there, and I would also agree that between 2005 and 2015, investments in various community serving programs were very, very limited in this country. Over to you, Chief Rempel.
Thank you. I think this is a complicated question for me because we don't receive funding, as far as I know, for these matters. We rely on the RCMP to deal with enforcement and justice. And unfortunately, with the province not doing tripartite agreements, it's very difficult for me to really answer this question. You know, when we have an issue, we call the RCMP, and we are told consistently that we cannot deal with that. It's not a real issue. And so, you know, I think tripartite agreements are things that should be looked at within the province of British Columbia to address, you know, to assist us in being able to address the concerns that we are having. As well, I would recommend cultural sensitivity training for all RCMP officers, and you know, again, preventative programs and such that Chief Blake had also mentioned.
Well, thank you. I was quite frankly unaware that many of these funding programs and opportunities would be, or your community might be ineligible for some of them. What are some methods by which we might consider expanding eligibility to include your community?
I'm not sure what the eligibility requirements are at this point. I've never actually heard of any of these, so it's new to me. I've been in this role since 2017, dealing with a lot of issues on reserve and not getting a lot of help. And so, you know, I'm looking forward to talking more about the FMPP and tripartite agreements to see where we can get. But we have asked for these programs before and been told no.
Okay, well, and with an investment of over $800 million over the next 5 years, I sincerely hope that that your community will be included, and I hope that we can work together to ensure that eligibility is there. Mr. Chair, I cede my time to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Van Couverden. And Madam Beyroube, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank the witnesses as well. You've shed some light on the issue. My question is as follows. Mr. Blake, earlier you said that you were underfunded. How will this new legislative framework help? How will it help the communities of the First Nations?
Thank you. Well, again, it's difficult for me to project that in not knowing what framework is going to be involved. We hope that what it does is increase our funding levels to longer term opportunities. Just for perspective purposes, First Nation police services are averaging about 25 to 30% less funding than our mainstream competitors across the country. It depends on the region you're in as to those funding levels, but that would be approximately what we see as a funding gap that's there. I do hope, once again, that the monies that are being considered are being done with the lens of what support can be provided to our communities. And Chief Rempel is absolutely correct in saying they need to lift the moratorium on this opportunity for communities to have a voice and a say in the police service that they wish to have, representing and providing public safety to their communities. So I think I would love to see that opportunity arise to more communities. I can tell you, as a chief of police here in Alberta, I receive phone calls weekly from communities that are asking me, how do we do this? And I wish I had an answer, and I wish there was an opportunity for them to look and to actually move forward in their own self-administered police service.
Donc, est-ce que vous avez participé au processus?
Did you participate in the process?
My apologies, the translation came in a bit late, but again, the process, from my understanding, if that was the question, relies on the provincial government of jurisdiction. Of course, that is the province of Alberta here, and so on across the country. So it would require them, because they're the ones who have the purview of policing within the province, and then it requires the support of the federal government additionally. So the process is there. Unfortunately, again, it's a cumbersome process, and you really need to get all the partners at the table, which is even in COVID times even more difficult. So it's not a simple process, but it is certainly something I hope that this money that's projected will go into, because it's needed, necessary, and I think the communities are very much wanting to have that process available to them.
J'aimerais que vous me parliez de la formation.
Could you talk about the training that you give to your First Nations police services? What have they received in terms of training? And for those who are not Indigenous?
Absolutely. Again, I'll speak on the Sutino experience, because provincially that will change throughout the country. Here, we have to follow all the legislative requirements that every police service in Alberta does. So we are no different. Our training needs to be at certain levels. We previously would send our officers to the RCMP's Depot Training Academy, but what we now have is an agreement with the Calgary Police Service, where our officers will attend their Crowfoot Training Center for the 6-month duration. They can continue to live here on the nation and travel to and from the training academy in Calgary. It also involves an ongoing training program that we have here. We have the same qualifications, recertifications. All of the things that we do is the same as every other service. So we have the same accreditation. We have the same authorities as other police services, and we're proud of that. We don't want to be less than, we want to be equal to. And when it comes to the ongoing training, I'm very proud to say that our service also looks to be leaders within the culturally appropriate training. We don't like, again, when you're looking at culture training, that's not real, it's a very sterile term. So again, we look at the reframing of our relationships with Indigenous peoples. And so what we do is we offer this training to all police services within the province. In fact, the country, we held one 2 weeks ago for 3 days. We had the global Indigenous model of what the situation that Canada has faced, and then we move it down. We move it to each region of the country. We also have the lived experiences from people who have suffered as a result of the justice system and all that we know of. We speak to elders. It's a 3-day program, and it's holistic and it's fulsome. And again, we host that training every 2 to 3 months, and we invite people across the country, law enforcement officials from everywhere, to take that on with us, because that's an essential need, and it's something that's missing, I think, in many jurisdictions.
Half a minute.
Est-ce que la pandémie a causé des...
Has the pandemic caused any recruiting problems?
I think it has. I think we've seen the way in which we engage with our possible candidates has been more virtual. I think, again, it hasn't diminished the interest in policing. One of the challenges, as I said, we face is that there's a disparity in the service that First Nation policing receives comparatively. So again, we want to be not a feeder system for other police services where we get them trained, we get them great, and we get them engaged, only for them to go somewhere else. So again, that would very much need some support from our funding partners to.
I'm sorry we've frozen at that point. Perhaps the technology will improve as we move on to our next questioner. Rachel Blaney, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and I want to thank both of the witnesses for being here today. And if I could start with you first, Haggis Rempel. First of all, thank you so much for being here with us this morning. The first thing that I will say is the recommendations that you talked about, please feel free to send that to the clerk and we'll make sure that that's included in the testimony. The first question that I have is around the land code. It seemed to me from your presentation that when you spoke about that, it was sort of a progressive process towards moving towards self-governance. And so you moved out of something where RCMP could come and enforce, you moved to something that was promoted by the federal government, and now you're in a position where you can't enforce it. I just want to make sure that I got that right.
Yeah, that's correct. So I actually developed our land code law prior to being elected in as chief. And so the big selling feature to members who are voting to whether or not to ratify a land code is that, you know, we have the ability to create our own laws, that they will be recognized in the courts and enforced by the RCMP. That's basically what the FNLM tells you. And so you go into this, you know, telling your members this is a great thing. And then when we get to the reality of it, we find that, yes, we can create the laws, but we can't get the enforcement, we can't get the recognition in the courts, you know, without going through a costly process like Comox had to do.
So it was an expensive court case, and the representative from Indigenous Services Canada today in his presentation called it a success earlier. I'm just wondering if you would describe it as a success, and did this result in any ability of the RCMP to be able to come onto your nation and enforce this bylaw?
It's actually a law, not a bylaw. I think that's an important distinction for sure. Sorry, what was the question again?
Was it a success?
Was it a success?
And
okay.
Does the court case, has it made it possible for the RCMP to come and enforce your law?
Sadly, no. I would call it a success. Absolutely. It is a precedent-setting case across Canada. I've been asked to speak all over Canada about this case. However, I'm facing this issue literally today with another trespass issue, and I don't have the confidence that the RCMP will be there to assist in the enforcement of, you know, our notice of trespass, even though the previous Thorderson decision, you know, ultimately the decision was that it needed to be enforced by the RCMP, and I just don't feel confident that that's going to happen today.
Okay, so after this court case, I'm just wondering, did anyone from the federal government, after seeing this success, reach out and talk about how they could support creating solutions for your nation in terms of enforcement of your laws?
No. I've been asked to speak by the Department of Justice in Ottawa, and I've done that with the lawyer several times, doing presentations on that case, but nobody has reached out to see how we could, fix it so that, you know, today when I have to go back up there and see if these trespassers have now left, there's no solutions in sight.
So I'm just wondering, was there any mechanism for you and your nation to recoup any of the cost to the nation to take on this really important court case?
Well, I think it's important to note that the First Nations Lands Management Resource Centre did end up reimbursing us for the cost of that court case. I'm not sure if today when we, find out if these trespassers are now leaving, we'll have to go to court again if they haven't. And I'm not sure that they would, feel as generous this time around. I do know that in speaking with the inspector here locally with the RCMP, he's feeling, like his hands are tied a little bit because there isn't that direction from his higher ups to enforce, because they do want to. It's just that they need that direction.
And I've heard that as well from RCMP, local RCMP across the riding, is often they feel very frustrated. They want to help, but they can't because there's not the clear pathway. So I'm just wondering, in terms of that discussion, you know, how does it feel to be trying to govern your nation, having taken that step towards having a land code, doing all of the work to have your own laws in place, consulting obviously with your membership, and then not being able to enforce? One of the things that really hit me about your presentation today was you said in this case that you're dealing with later today is they're literally mocking you and saying, go ahead. And I'm just wondering, like, how does that feel for you as a leader of your community, and how does that resonate within your community?
Well, it's absolutely frustrating on so many, for myself, and speaking, I mean, we're only speaking of the trespass issues, but I am regularly in the face of crack dealers who are not band members. They are guests of band members living on reserve. And because we have certificates of possession, we can't simply kick people out because they have rights to their homes and their properties. And so, you know, I'm consistently putting myself in danger because we can't get that support that is very desperately needed. And it's frustrating from a leadership perspective to see how frustrated our members are. You know, the question is, why isn't Chief and Council doing anything? And we regularly have our liaison, our CMP liaison officer attending our meetings to try and explain to the membership why Chief and Council can't achieve these things, why we can't kick crack dealers off our lands, why we can't deal with trespassers. And it's because of the lack of authority given to the local RCMP detachments from above.
And so continuous conflict in your own nation because you cannot enforce what you have tried to create a law for. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Right. What a conversation. Members of the committee, I think we can manage an intervention from each of the four parties again, which will require a motion to extend the meeting past 1 o'clock. And also there's a very brief little bit of budgetary business that we need to do. So can I have a motion to extend beyond 1 o'clock?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you very much. Mr. Vidal moves, seconded. All in favor? That's carried. We'll go to Mr. Vierson, Mr. Batiste, and Blaney. Arnold.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. I'm just wondering, the respective communities that you operate in and represent, what's the size in terms of the number of people? Ms. Rempel?
We are a very small nation. Comox First Nation has 345 members currently, with about 112 living on reserve.
Okay. And Chief Blake, is he back yet?
Yes. Yeah, sorry for the technical difficulties here, but I think we've resolved it. Our community here, we have approximately 2,400 band members of the Sutino Nation. We have some unique opportunities and challenges because we are so close to Calgary. There's a very aggressive and visionary development program here where we were the first First Nation to have a Costco. And so we have a very strong commercial development which sees literally thousands of Calgarians on our territories each and every day. So again, although our population may be smaller comparatively to some others, we do have some demands and challenges, but opportunities that we're very proud of. So again, our landmass is about 100 square miles, and 3 of our borders butt up against the city of Calgary.
How many members of your police force?
Again, very fortunate. Our community has taken public safety and community safety to heart, and 10 of our officers are funded through the tripartite agreement. So that's the 52 from the feds, the 48 from the provincial government, and 16 of our officers are fully funded by our nation. So again, they more than double the funding amounts that our funding partners within the province and federal governments give. 26 officers in total, 32 total staff members.
Ms. Rempel, just around building capacity, 112 members on the reserve, the ability to build a justice system in your nation, it looks like you just purely don't have the numbers to be able to manage that capacity. Are you attempting to what's the process that you're going through to I know that in my area, most of the 14 First Nations in my area, all of them are dramatically larger than that, and they are struggling as well. Where would you like to see that go in terms of a tribunal or something, so that we can get some more immediate justice? Because the timing of the justice in many cases, like enforcement's an issue, but then also like if your golf clubs go missing, 3 years later you finally have some resolution to that. Well, that's 3 golf seasons gone, right? Like you just go to the store and buy new golf clubs. How are you dealing with that in your community?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for the question. Right now, under our land code, we are developing a community protection law, an adjudication law, and a justice tribunal. It doesn't specifically say that we can do that within the framework agreement, but it doesn't say we cannot. So those are the options we're looking at. But we have so many First Nation communities adjacent to Comox First Nation, like Hamalko, Campbell River, Cape Mudge, and others that are also land code nations. And so in talking with other lands managers when I was prior to being chief, we had kicked around the idea of developing a First Nations enforcement kind of department where we could cost share that amongst First Nations lands management nations. And that's a possible solution. They would, of course, need the required training and the funding. And so that's always been the question, is where does that funding come from? Because I don't think that the FNLM is as funded as they could be by the federal government for the amount of authority that they have passed on to First Nations. I feel that there's a serious lack in funding for the FNLM.
All right, so you have, because like in my area, they work with, they call them tribal councils, right? So like we have Lakeshore Police Services. They are operated through the one tribal council, which is 7 First Nations in the area. So you would have that similar opportunity in your neck of the woods, it sounds like.
There's potential for it, for sure. The Vancouver Island, the dynamics of the Coast Salish and the Kwakwaka'wakw is always a concern in funding. Comox First Nation being both Coast Salish and Kwakwaka'wakw, we're always at a tug of war on which side we're on and which funding opportunities we can access. So, it's all about trying to work together and move forward together, in my opinion. And, that's just the approach I've always taken.
And that brings us to time. Thanks, Mr. Bruce. Mr. Batiste, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My initial question is for Chief Rempel, and I'm coming to you from the Eskasoni Mi'kmaq community. We have about close to 4,000 band members, and one of the things that I've been in the rooms when hearing RCMP saying, well, their hands are tied, they can't help out with this. I'm wondering, I see the same frustration in your statements. I'm wondering what process would you like to see whereby chief and councils can appeal decisions where we hear hands are tied by local enforcement officers? And is this part of, do you think, what should be the $861 million for 5 years that we put towards policing?
Great question. Yeah, thanks for that. I honestly would really love to see some of that funding go towards tripartite agreements being offered again to First Nations in British Columbia, because, we have, prior to my being elected chief, the previous chief as well was trying to negotiate for a tripartite agreement so that we could work together on how to address these issues. And, it's just been a consistent answer of no, we don't do those anymore. And so opportunities like that, I think, need to be brought back, because we're never going to address these issues without having those agreements in place and working together.
Can I get a sense of, from you and your experience, where the obstacles lie in terms of, you're saying that they don't do that tripartite? Is it just the provincial government, and would funding make a difference, or is it the generally that they just don't want to do tripartite agreements with Indigenous communities anymore?
I'm not sure. I'm not fully involved in the discussions. It comes to my table at the chief and council level as just kind of the response has been no. So it'd be our band administrator trying to negotiate those things. But yeah, I'm not sure if it's just the province or if, they're not being funded federally, could be the issue as well. But I know the RCMP locally would really like to be able to enforce and assist the First Nation. But you know, I get that sense anyway. It depends, I guess, on the inspector, because the previous inspector had no interest in helping Comox First Nation in any way, and so it really does depend as well, and who's helming the local detachment.
Okay, appreciate that. Chief Blake, you said that you were part of processes whereby you meet with police chiefs from other areas. Can you tell me some of the best practices you're hearing from across the province and across nationally about how Indigenous people are able to pass laws and get enforcement of those laws?
Thank you for the question. I guess when we're looking, each community is very unique. Each governance structure is very unique. So it's very difficult to give a global picture other than there's a strong desire with all the communities to have legislation that's reflective of their community and their desires on law enforcement, as well as legislation that supports the safe running of their community and the safety of their community members. I think when you look at best practices, there's many across the country. Obviously, my familiarity comes with what we have locally. And I do think it really takes a Herculean effort to move this to where there's actually buy-in from our province within the provincial court system. Obviously, if it has to deal with the federal side, the COVID laws that have come in, the Health Act laws, that is being supported through Public Prosecution Services Canada, and that's good to see. But again, I think what I always like to say is it's really important to hear from each community as to what their uniqueness is and how their structures support the community. I will say in our instance here is there's a strong community connection. Every 2 years, we reach out to every single house within this nation. We have a series of questions to ask about policing. What's good, what's bad, what are we doing well, what do we need to do a lot better? And so that gives us the understanding, not only from the government, our local government, who's very engaged, but it also gives us the understanding of the community. And that's the voice that we need to listen to. So again, what they do is they tell us where we need to improve, but they also give us advice on some of the areas that seep into the justice system, again, where it's more restorative in nature. So I would honestly say that the nation that I work for and humbly work for is a best practice. But there's multitudes across this country that are doing an excellent job as well.
Okay, thank you. One last question for Chief Rempel. I understand that Assembly of First Nations has a sub-chiefs committee on justice and policing. Are you involved with that? And have you reached out to them about some of the concerns you have about the national approaches?
I have not heard of that, actually. I am hesitant to participate in these big events because it seems that there's always a focus on certain First Nations and not necessarily all First Nations. And so I don't feel meaningfully represented by the AFN, less so with the BC AFN, and perhaps I should take it to them first and see where we can get some headway with the BC AFN or the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. Might be a good approach as well. But yeah, certainly okay. I haven't to date.
Thank you so much. That brings us to Sylvie, 2.5 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for Mr. Blake. There are a lot of studies that talk about systemic racism in police forces, which leads to distrust and the over-incarceration rate of Indigenous people. So how does the First Nations Police Department ensure that there's confidence within their own community?
That's an excellent question, and I think every organization needs to address it and look at it for what it really is. And yes, that exists in policing. I was at the RCMP for 24 years prior to coming to the Sutino Nation Police Service. So I can attest to the importance of recognizing it as the first step, and then it's addressing it. And it comes through, again, the component that I see as the most important within our service is we have approximately 68% of our service officers self-identify as Indigenous. Those that don't have a very strong understanding of our community, and our community outreach is part of that understanding, not just of Indigenous culture, but specifically to the Sutino culture, which has its own series of traditions, history, language, all of those things that when you become part of the community or engage with the community, you recognize and understand the importance of respect and you recognize and understand that you may have different opinions, you may have different thoughts, you've grown up differently, but ultimately the common goal is again for the respect from each other. So as I say, in our instance here, it comes through training, engagement, and I can say that I think that most First Nation police services are very reflective of the communities they serve. Perhaps not community members. In our case, we have 4 officers that are from our community, but that poses some challenges as well to police the community you grew up in. Some people find it very difficult, but we also want to make sure we're mentoring our community members to become and consider a profession in policing, because that is where this change will really come to place, where we have more representation in policing.
That's all. Thank you. Thanks. Rachel, close off, please.
I will. Thank you so much, Chair. Agus Rumpel, if I could come back to you. I have 2 questions. I'm going to put them together in one and then just let you answer, since I only have 2.5 minutes. The first is, after the court case in 2018, looking back, would you make the same decision to move towards the land code or not? And the second question is, what do you think would be helpful from the federal government so that your nation has better outcomes for exercising policing authority over your own people with your own laws in your own territory?
Thank you for that. I would 100% still look to the land code. As difficult as it is to have these laws and things enforced and recognized, I do believe it's better than the Indian Act. I think, the Indian Act is a very oppressive thing and very limiting to First Nations. And so, I do have faith in the system, and I have faith that we can work together to address these issues. It just takes an initiative from the federal and provincial governments to actually not just listen to First Nations, but to hear us, hear what the issues are, and work together to address them. Yeah.
And then the second part of that was just, what would be helpful from the federal government to actually make those outcomes concrete?
Well, I think better funding, specifically for the First Nations lands management. I think better funding for the issues around enforcement. In a treaty perspective, looking to tighten up the treaty language and ensure that there is the opportunity for adjudication and enforcement and recognition of our laws as enactments within the provincial system, I think are critical, so that we can actually be self-governing, because if you don't have the enforcement of your laws, then you're not actually a self-governing nation.
And the last question is, you talked about the last inspector was not very helpful. This one is. And I just want to ask you, how does it feel to sort of know that there isn't a system in place to make sure enforcement is supported? It's based on a personality.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. I mean, when we talk about systemic racism, that is most certainly what we were facing prior to this inspector coming in. And now I would say we have a wonderful relationship. We have a liaison officer that works very closely with Comox First Nation and is very communicative with myself and the band administrator. And that's been really important. There's a willingness to have cultural sensitivity discussions within the detachment with the officers in a post-COVID environment. And I think that's really important as well.
On behalf of the members of the committee, I want to thank our witnesses today for brilliant testimony and especially your candor. This is what we really need in panels like this, and we got it in great ways. Chief Blake, I just want to share with you, the policeman I know best has 3 university degrees, and before he joined the RCMP, he was doing archaeological surveys overseen by the First Nations, and got to be friends and joined them, and was invited to reservations to participate in various activities. And of all of the things that he did prior to Depot, that may have been the strongest growth experience that he had in terms of policing. So there are some great people out there. I know that. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Panel, just before we sign off, I need your approval for 2 proposed study budgets. One is for this one, otherwise nobody gets paid. the current enforcement study and one for the upcoming sex trafficking study. They were distributed last Friday. You should have them. Is there anyone opposed to the budgets as they were presented? Seeing none, we'll assume that they are adopted. We meet next Tuesday with more enforcement witnesses. On Thursday, we have our regular meeting, and as our request to extend the regular meeting was denied for very specific technical reasons. We have an extra 1-hour panel with additional enforcement witnesses in the evening from 6:30 to 7:30 p.m. And with that, I need a motion to adjourn. Mr. Batiste, Ms. Blaney, all in favor? That's carried. Thanks for a brilliant hour. Thank you.
Thank you.